The subcommittee will come to order, and I would like to apologize to those people who were here at 10, but we had a technical problem and were delayed until 10:30. Yesterday, the subcommittee convened for opening statements, and at my request, with the concurrence of Mr. Waxman, it was agreed that the chairman and ranking members of the full committee and subcommittee would be recognized to give their opening statements this morning before beginning consideration of the bill. Therefore, Mr. McNerney, Mr. Waxman, Chairman Upton, and I will be recognized for an opening statement, and then the subcommittee will begin official consideration of H.R. 3826, the Electricity Security and Affordability Act. And so at this time, the chair would recognize himself for a 5-minute opening statement. In January 2008, then Senator Obama and candidate for president, in an interview with the San Francisco Chronicle editorial board, said in response to a question about his cap-and-trade plan, if somebody wants to build a coal-powered plant, they can. It's just that it will bankrupt them. Under my plan, electricity rates would necessarily skyrocket. Now, in 2009, Congress debated regulating carbon dioxide emissions from power plants, and during that debate, the cap-and-trade legislation was passed in the House and was never passed in the U.S. Senate. It was controlled, the House by Democrats and the U.S. Senate by Democrats. The President, of course, was disappointed that the cap-and-trade legislation did not pass. A few months later, he gave a speech in Copenhagen at the Climate Change Conference where he committed to a 17% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2020 and by more than 80% reduction by 2050. Now, in a November 2010 interview, when asked about regulating carbon dioxide emissions through some type of administrative action, President Obama replied, cap and trade is just one way of skinning the cat. It is not the only way. It was a means, not an end, and I'm going to be looking for other means to address this issue. And then on June 25th, 2013, Daniel Schrag, a White House climate advisor and professor at Harvard, told the New York Times, the one thing the President really needs to do now is to begin the process of shutting down conventional coal plants. Politically, the White House is hesitant to say they're having a war on coal. On the other hand, a war on coal is exactly what is needed. Now, that same day, the President delivered a speech at Georgetown and issued a memorandum. And in that speech, he announced his climate action plan and directed EPA to complete carbon dioxide emission standards on new and existing power plants. And then on September the 20th, the President set the date, September 20th, 2013, EPA proposed for a second time regulations to control greenhouse gas emissions from new power plants. Now, under EPA's proposal, when it becomes final, it will be impossible to build a new coal-powered plant in America because the technology is not available. Now, EPA testified before our subcommittee that the proposal that they had is based on 4 demonstration projects, all of which rely on heavy government subsidies, and only one of them in the United States is even in the process of being built today. But those emission standards set the guidelines for future new coal-powered plants. And we sent a letter to EPA. We think that they're in direct contradiction of the 2005 Energy Power Act, which says specifically you cannot, under Section 111, set standards based on plants that receive government subsidies. So today, what our objective is, we have legislation that we think restores some common sense to the extreme views of the President. And he's been taking unilateral action with the help of EPA under the guise of Massachusetts EPA and regulating greenhouse gas to the extent we cannot build a new coal-powered plant in America. The President is trying to move us down the road that the Europeans went down. And I would remind all of you that most people consider the cap-and-trade system in Europe to have been a failure. Within the last year, they have mothballed 30 gigawatts of new gas-powered electricity plants in Europe because gas prices are so high because they're buying it from Russia. And last year, Europe imported 45% of our coal exports as they're building new coal plants in Europe. So our legislation says EPA can regulate. We simply set the guidelines for these new powered plants so that in the future, if Americans determine that it's in the best interest to build a coal-powered plant, we can do so. So today, we hope to start a national debate because up to now, this has been unilateral action on the part of the executive branch of government. I welcome the debate that we have today on this bill, and at this time, I would like to recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, for a 5-minute opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Human-caused climate change is one of the most important issues our nation faces today. The evidence for climate change is overwhelming, be it superstorms, megadroughts, shifting of biological systems, the disappearance of historical glaciers, ocean acidification, or the melting of the polar ice cap. This scale of change has resulted in the agreement of the vast majority of scientists and experts. We should be making every effort to identify the best ways to reduce greenhouse gases instead of finding ways to expand their emissions. Climate change will affect our entire economy, our public health, our national security, and the environment. I believe that H.R. 3286, as drafted, will be a major step backward in solving the climate change challenge. As we heard at our subcommittee hearing in November, this legislation would have the effect of preventing the Clean Air Act from reducing carbon pollution from power plants. This would be deeply irresponsible. Many of my colleagues have noted that the nation's carbon pollution has declined from the heights of a few years ago, but that doesn't mean it's time to stop our efforts. Our emissions are still far above where they need to be according to scientists and policy experts. At the Energy Information Agency announced last week that energy-related carbon dioxide emissions are beginning to edge back up, largely because of an increase in coal consumption in the electric power sector. H.R. 3286 will accelerate this trend of increasing carbon emissions. Several carbon capture and sequestration commercial-scale projects are expected to be operational in the United States next year, and other such projects are already operational around the world. Rather than rejecting CCS just as the technology is emerging, we should follow these projects and benefit from their successes. We can monitor the EPA's rulemaking as they proceed. Creating the proper incentives for technological innovation will greatly benefit our nation. We've seen how encouraging innovation pollution controls, such as scrubbers, have helped drive pollution reduction despite the chorus of naysayers who predicted massive costs. This legislation before us today is the wrong approach. It limits new technologies before they've had an opportunity to grow and mature. We should approach this issue from a science-based perspective that believes in technology and innovation. Unfortunately, the bill we are considering today does not take that approach. Any Democratic members wish to add? Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back this time. At this time, I recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Upton, for 5 minutes.
Well, thanks, Mr. Chairman. I know that this hearing was delayed because of the problem with the mics, and I just my statement was put into the record yesterday so people could recite it with me, and but I'm not going to ask them to do that. I just want to commend you for a bipartisan approach, urge my colleagues to support it, and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, for 5 minutes.
Well, Mr. Chairman, this is the first time this subcommittee has met for business this year, and it should be a time for new beginnings, new approaches, the time to work together on trying to figure out what to do with our energy and environmental problems in this nation. Instead, the House Republicans are starting in 2014 right where they left off in 2013. They're denying the science of climate change, ignoring the risks, and trying to stop the Environmental Protection Agency from protecting the American people from carbon pollution. The bill before us today would amend the Clean Air Act to block any limits on carbon pollution from coal-fired power plants, which happens to be the largest source of carbon pollution in the United States. This is a recipe for disaster. In terms of climate, events over the past few weeks have further underscored the costs of climate change. We see it, we hear about it almost daily. When you disrupt the climate system of the planet, heat, droughts, and storms are the impacts that we see. In my own state of California, Mr. Chairman, we're facing devastating and intensifying drought. Last year was the driest year on record in California. Los Angeles experienced its driest year since they started keeping records in 1877. San Francisco also broke previous records, which extend back to 1849. UCLA modeling suggests that these rainfall levels may well become the new normal by mid-century. Now in our third year of drought, California's reservoirs are depleted, the costs are mounting. The water shortage is fallowing farmlands, destroying salmon populations, hurting ski resorts, and requiring mandatory rationing in some cities. These are just some of the things we're seeing by way of costs in terms of climate heating up. But the costs of climate disruption are going to get worse, much worse, if we don't act now to cut carbon pollution. So when we had our hearing on this bill last November, I turned to the Republicans and I said, what is your plan to deal with climate change? We haven't heard of anything. We have no alternative. I'm still waiting for an answer. The House Republican solution is nothing. Their approach is to deny the problem, try to stop EPA action, to weaken the Clean Air Act. The bill before us today will effectively repeal EPA's existing legal authority to address carbon pollution from power plants under the Clean Air Act. We'll hear that EPA must be stopped or it will be the end of coal. Well, that's absolute nonsense. We use lots of coal today, and we'll continue to use lots of coal for some time to come. EPA's rules will require that new coal power plants use technology that you can go out and buy today to control carbon pollution. I don't think that's too much to ask. And EPA hasn't even issued a proposal for reducing carbon pollution from existing power plants. But before they issue a proposal, our committee, Republicans, I hope you not unanimously, because you all don't come from coal areas, would take away the jurisdiction to even issue a proposal. Let's just stop them from making any proposal. The agency is currently undertaking an impressive outreach effort to gather stakeholder views, even before the formal notice and comment process. Why don't we see what the agency comes up with before declaring we're going to block it? My message to my Republican colleagues is simple. If you don't like what EPA is doing, tell us what your plan is. Last year, the President asked Congress to work with him on a legislative solution to climate change. But he also said, if you don't act, if you have no proposals, step aside. The President is going to lead. Denying it or ignoring the science is not a responsible way to govern. Passing the bill before us today is not a responsible way to act. It will only jeopardize the future of our children and grandchildren. Don't be so myopic that you look only at your coal industry in your district and play to the cheap seats and tell them how you're saving them from the war on coal. There's no war on coal, but there is a problem, and we've got to solve the problem, not deny it. Yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. That concludes today's opening statement. So now the chair would call up H.R. 3826 and ask the clerk to report.
H.R. 3826, to provide direction to the Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency regarding the establishment of standards for emissions of any greenhouse gas from fossil fuel-fired electric utility generating units and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open for amendment at any point, so ordered. In keeping with our rules, I would first ask, are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Seeing none, are there any amendments to the bill? The gentleman from California is recognized.
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3826, offered by Mr. Waxman of California.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Mr. Chairman and my colleagues, we've asked the Republicans, what is it that you would do for dealing with the climate change if you don't like EPA's approach? And the bill we're considering today is not an answer to that question. Instead, it amounts to a declaration of defeat. In essence, it says we're not going to lift a finger to slow dangerous climate change. It says we refuse to take action now, and we only want to make future action impossible. The policy underlying this bill seems to be that coal-fired power plants should be able to pollute indefinitely and with impunity. This bill would condition EPA's authority on conditions that will simply never be met, at least not as long as it is cheaper to dump pollution into the air rather than clean it up. Under this bill, EPA could not require new power plants to control their pollution until 6 power plants in different parts of the country voluntarily install pollution controls. Well, that's just not what for-profit enterprises do. And this bill would create a further disincentive for such voluntary actions. This bill would also bar EPA from requiring existing power plants to control their pollution until Congress passes a new law. Well, I understand that some don't like EPA's approach, but this proposal is just not serious. For years now, I've said to Chairman Upton that we're willing to consider any suggestion that will reduce carbon pollution and slow climate change. I proposed a market-based cap-and-trade approach. I proposed a carbon tax approach. I support regulatory approaches, whether market-based or performance standards. I strongly support international efforts. I support more funding for research, demonstration, and deployment of clean energy technologies. And in fact, in the Waxman-Markey bill, we dedicated $60 billion to deploy carbon capture and sequestration technology on new coal plants. I support state actions. I support education programs and incentives for voluntary actions by individuals and businesses. But what Congress can't do is throw itself in the gears of progress. If the House Republicans don't want EPA to act on climate change, they need to establish a credible alternative approach. And that's all my amendment does. It does not change how this bill would limit EPA's authority to address carbon pollution from coal-fired power plants. This amendment simply says that those limits on EPA's authority only apply once there is an alternative approach to replace the EPA rules that is at least as effective as those rules in reducing carbon pollution. So my message from my Republican colleagues is, if you don't like EPA's approach, propose your own plan. Don't just say no to everything. Giving up is not the American way. Congress can do better, and I believe that the American people expect us to do better. We can act to slow climate change, and there's still time to make a difference if we act now. And if this Congress is capable of nothing else, at least we can avoid making some things worse. We can get out of the way and let the Obama administration get on with the job, since the Republican House won't do it. So this amendment is simply saying to the Republicans, climate change is real and urgent. I hope you'll support this amendment to say that we have some other way before we're going to let this EPA, this bill stop EPA from acting on doing anything. And I proffer that amendment to my colleagues. I would look forward to support for it. And to vote down this amendment, to vote for this bill, is to put your head in the sand. And this is not the way to begin 2014, nor to tell future generations that we just don't have any ideas, but we're going to let climate change continue. And that's just unfortunate, but future generations, not way in the future, but our kids and our grandchildren and ourselves will just bear the brunt, and we'll just continue to allow this carbon pollution to increase from the major source, which is coal-burning power plants. So I ask for an aye vote on the substitute, on the amendment.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizing himself in opposition to the amendment. We all recognize that climate change is an issue. We know that CO2 emissions in America are the lowest that they have been in 20 years. There are other issues facing the American people today and people throughout the world, and that is having a growing economy, creating jobs. And certainly this administration, and I respectfully say this, but I think the President's views have been extreme. He could not get through a Democrat-controlled House and Senate, the cap-and-trade legislation, and so he said that he was going to basically do it unilaterally through international agreements, through directing international financing institutes like the World Bank, others, the Export-Import Bank of the U.S., not to provide any funding for a coal-powered plant anywhere, even though countries like Bangladesh and elsewhere are still burning fuel oil, which is much dirtier than clean coal technology plants. And under the proposed regulation of EPA, you would not be able to build a coal plant in America because the technology has not been adequately demonstrated as required by the Clean Air Act. And so our legislation says, and I think this is certainly an issue that Congress should be involved in, we're simply saying we will set some parameters here. You can require the cleanest technology available, but it's got to be adequately demonstrated on the new plants. And we know that they've already delayed the effective date for the new plant regulation until January of 2015 because they wanted to be sure the elections had passed in 2014 before they went into effect. And we also know that they're going to be proposing the existing plant regulations on June of 2015, and is it June of 2015 or 2014? 2014, and be final on June of 2015. And so our legislation simply says on the existing regulations that will take effect in June of 2015, we want Congress to set the effective date for that regulation, considering the impact on the economy, on jobs, on our ability to compete in the global marketplace. Because America does not have to take a back seat to anyone on cleaning up the emissions. We certainly don't have to take a back seat to China, to India, and other parts of the world. And as I said in my opening statement, the President is trying to push us down the road of following Europe. And Europe is building more coal plants today than they ever have because their regulatory system has not really worked. And they have to buy high gas prices coming out of Russia. So the gentleman's amendment here would basically say that EPA can keep doing what it's doing until there's an alternative federal program put in place whenever that may happen. Well, from the legislative branch of government, we're saying, look, we need a national debate on this issue before we move down this road. And that's what this legislation is designed to do. And that's why we've been encouraged that a number of Democratic senators are working with us on this legislation because they think it provides a more balanced view. And I understand that we have different views on the priorities. I know that all of us agree that we want best what's for the American people. And so that's what this legislation is all about. And because of that, I would respectfully oppose the gentleman's amendment.
Gentleman yield
Mr. Chairman.
for a question.
Gentlemen, you.
Yeah, I'd be happy to yield.
So, as I understand what you're saying, you want a debate and you want Congress to pass a law before we take action on climate change. Is that correct?
Well, I think we've taken a lot of action on climate change already. That's why our CO2 emissions are the lowest they've been in 20 years.
I question that, but before we deal with coal-burning power plants, which is the largest source of these emissions, you want Congress to pass a law, and I would submit, if you look at the record, Congress doesn't pass laws very quickly, and this may take decades, and we could get filibusters, and we can get committees to block it, and it may or may never happen. So we go back to square one. We, in fact, not square one, we go to -1 if we repeal the law.
Well, Mr. Waxman, I mean, the reason we want to start on this legislation now is this new regulation will take effect in January of next year.
What's your alternative?
We have an alternative. They're going to have to use the best available technology, and that's what this bill is about. No one expects a new coal-powered plant is going to be built immediately because the natural gas prices are too low. But what if 5 years down the road, someone decides the technology is there, we have good technology for cleaner emissions, and we need it to strengthen our economy and create jobs and be more competitive in the global marketplace. That's what we're trying to do. My time's expired, so does anyone, the gentlelady from California, Ms. Matsui, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support Mr. Waxman's amendment. It's just common sense. We must do something about climate change. If Congress is going to prevent EPA from acting, the responsibility to act falls to us. But if Congress can't or won't act itself, we shouldn't stop EPA from taking steps to protect the American people and the world from the huge harms of unabated climate change. Across this country, we're already seeing the effects of climate change. Sea level rise, more frequent and more intense forest fires, more frequent and more intense droughts, more frequent and more intense floods, more extreme storm events. People have lost their homes and lost income. Lives are at risk. Scientists are confident that these harms will rapidly grow worse as carbon pollution continues to rise. We no longer have the choice of whether to mitigate global warming by reducing carbon pollution or whether to adapt to changes it is causing. We waited too long to act. Now we must both mitigate pollution to avert far worse harm and adapt to the harm we can no longer avoid. Unfortunately, this bill would do neither. In fact, it would exacerbate the problems we face. The bill would effectively eliminate EPA's authority under the Clean Air Act to require the largest point source of carbon pollution by far, coal-fired power plants, to clean up their pollution. That's not right. Regulating under existing Clean Air Act authority is not the only way we could address carbon pollution. In fact, Congress could adopt new authority that would be broader, more efficient, and more flexible than existing Clean Air Act authorities. President Obama has made it clear that he prefers Congress to act, and House Democrats passed a bill to do so. But the congressional majority have overwhelmingly opposed any positive legislation on climate change. President Obama also made it clear that doing nothing isn't an option. He pledged that if Congress won't act to protect the Americans from carbon pollution, he would, and he is keeping his word. I'm confident that the EPA is taking on this task in a deliberate, reasonable, and balanced way. EPA's proposal would require new coal-fired power plants to use available and effective technology to control their carbon pollution. This is a balanced approach. It doesn't require plants to capture all or even most of the carbon pollution. It just requires plants to install technology and use it to capture and sequester about 1/3 to 1/2 of the carbon pollution. Allowing partial capture rather than full capture substantially lowers costs and gives utilities time to gain more experience with the technology before any more rigorous standards would be considered. For existing coal-fired power plants, EPA is talking to stakeholders across the country and gathering recommendations even before issuing a proposal. I support this approach, but I also believe we could replace the EPA regulations with a broader, more flexible economy-wide program to reduce carbon pollution. And that's why I support Mr. Waxman's amendment. We could choose EPA regulations under current authority, or we can try to come up with something even better. But taking no action on climate change would be a disaster for our constituents, all Americans, and people across the world. And with that, I yield back.
Gentlelady, yield to me for...
Yes, I would yield to you.
I thank you for yielding to me. I just want to point out the basic underlying reason why government gets involved in environmental protection. There's a failure in the market. There's no reason why any business would want to install anti-pollution equipment that costs money if their competitors don't also do the same thing. Why do it? It doesn't make business sense. So government comes in and establishes a level playing field. If there's technology, if there's a way to reduce pollution, you have to do it. Either government requires a specific way to do it or a certain target that must be achieved, because the market won't push businesses to do it on its own. Now, the chairman said, in his amendment, we don't want EPA to require technology until technology is already being used. Well, why would any profit-making utility want to install pollution that costs money unless they're required to do it? That's just against common sense. So if we want something to be done and make it fair and make it assured for the public commons, we have to require it. And we could talk about how to require it, but simply to say, oh, we're not going to require anything until it's already done is like we're not going to have a chicken before the egg, we're not going to have an egg before the chicken. Thank you for yielding to me.
Mr. Waxman, I may make one comment. When scrubbers, well, I'll just make it on my time. When scrubbers were required, they had been adequately demonstrated. The chair, I'd recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Common sense. Common sense. The marketplace won't make them do it. So what does that mean? Let me translate that for you. What that means is we'll make things cost more in the United States by having the government raise the costs. We will get a level playing field in the United States, but an unlevel playing field with all of our competitors across the world. Do you think that the Chinese are considering this policy adopted in this amendment? No, they are not. Do you think that any of the other Asian nations or the emerging economies of Africa are going to consider this when they do it? We know that from NASA studies, that's right, science, takes about 10 days for the air to get from the middle of the Gobi Desert to the eastern shore of Virginia. And when that air comes across without even the reasonable regulations that we have now, when you add these additional regulations on, you push our jobs to China and other places in Asia, and they send us back, that's right, their mercury, their pollution, their problems. We cannot solve as one nation of this world the problems that Mr. Waxman has referenced. Whatever the problems are, we cannot destroy our economy so that we can say, well, we feel good about it. My district is a poor district compared with Mr. Waxman's and others. It has great people who want to work, and many of them have been working in the coal industry for generations. And many of them today are the casualties in the war on coal. And ladies and gentlemen, I have to tell you, we are not surrendering in that war on coal. And I appreciate the chairman, Mr. Whitfield, bringing this bill forward, because this bill is not a surrender. It's more like the demand that was made by the Germans at Bastogne to General McAuliffe. And this bill, Chairman Whitman is saying to those who have the war on coal, who don't care about the people of the coal regions of this country, who don't care if they're unemployed, who don't care if they can't even afford the cheap seats, we are saying nuts to you. We're going to support the American economy. We're going to support jobs, and we are not going to adopt this amendment. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Does anyone seek recognition to speak on the gentleman's amendment?
Mr. Chair,
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 5 minutes.
thank you. I support the amendment by Mr. Waxman. Our House Republican colleagues keep mentioning that United States greenhouse gas emissions are falling. They suggest that the United States doesn't need to do anything more about climate change, and I think nothing could be further from the truth. United States greenhouse gas emissions did fall in 2008 and 2009. And that was explained primarily by the economic recession. That's an understandable statement. But since that time, our overall emissions have grown. Cumulatively, United States emissions have grown, not fallen, in 2010 and 2011, the two most recent years for which data are available. Claims that emissions are falling are looking only at the energy sector, where fuel switching from coal to natural gas and electricity generation has helped control emissions somewhat. And even those claims are no longer accurate. Just yesterday, the Energy Information Administration, the EIA, reported that energy-related carbon dioxide emissions last year grew by 2% as a result of fuel switching in the other direction, going from natural gas back to coal. So I think that needs to be stated clearly as we review this legislation and the amendment. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Did the gentleman yield back? A gentleman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes.
And I'll yield to Mr. Shimkus after I make a brief statement. I notice that we're now talking about climate change instead of global warming. So when you talk about climate change, if it's hot in the summer, it's because of CO2, I suppose, and if it's cold in the winter, it's because of CO2, I suppose. So whichever way it goes, it's because of this dreaded CO2. That's a pretty good argument if you can sustain it, which whatever the reality is, it's because of the demon CO2. Well, the truth is the climate's been changing as far as we know, as long as there's been an Earth. And it's only since about the 1870s or 1880s that we've had man-made CO2 emissions significant enough that they could even plausibly have any kind of an impact. And of course, in that brief time, it's gone up and it's gone down. I mean, the temperature's gone up and the temperature's gone down. So now that our friends who opposed Mr. Whitfield's bill have the moral high ground of climate change as opposed to global warming, it really doesn't matter what the facts are. They can be against Mr. Whitfield because they know the climate's going to change no matter what. Well, you know, let's bring this thing back to economic reality. The current EPA proposal or standard would make it impossible to ever build another coal-fired power plant, a new one, because that technology does exist, but it is so expensive that the cost of the technology doubles the cost of generating the power. Now, in a scarce market, I guess it's possible that one could economically justify to your stockholders building a power plant that doubles the price of power generation. But we're not in a scarce market. We're in a market where we have more natural gas coming online every day, and natural gas has a double advantage. It's less expensive than coal, which is a good thing, and it has half the emissions. So what Mr. Whitfield is doing is saying, look, the market is moving away from coal because of economic reasons and environmental reasons, but let's at least give coal a chance. Let's set a standard that can actually meet the marketplace, that you can develop a technology that can actually be competitive in the marketplace, that the utilities can build a coal-fired power plant and actually generate power at approximately the same equivalent cost as perhaps natural gas. That's all he's saying. I don't think that's a bad idea. Gives coal a chance, doesn't really change market economics, and maybe our friends in the out there in the research industry can come up with a way through sequestration or carbon capture or something that really make some economic sense. But under the current EPA rule, you're just, you know, stabbing coal in the back and saying we're never going to give you a chance. And Mr. Whitfield's bill at least says give coal a chance. And with that, I yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you, and I'll try to be brief. Mr. Dingle knows and Mr. Waxman knows that when the Clean Air Act was passed, scrubber technology was available. And carbon capture and sequestration technology is not commercially available at this time. And the Kemper plant is a perfect example. It's $5 billion in overrun with hundreds of millions of dollars of investment by the federal government. And the Southern company who's building the Kemper plant said, this plant, and I quote, cannot be consistently replicated on a national level and should not serve as a primary basis for new emission standards impacting all new coal-fired power plants. So the point of our debate is the EPA is required, if they're going to put new standards on, to have commercial available technology to do that. It is not available today, and because it's not available today, the EPA should not place these standards on. Otherwise, we'll fall into what Mr. Barton said, Mr. Griffith said, is that you'll price this power so far out of the market that it won't even be viable anymore, which is part of the reason why the war on coal is to price the cost of electric power through coal, which is the cheapest power that you can have today. We just want to make sure it's technologically available, and that's really the basis of that's why I asked for people to vote against the amendment. Yield back my time, or yield back time, Mr. Barton.
Gentleman's time has expired. Is there further discussion on the amendment? The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I won't take anywhere near the 5 minutes, but so far the entire discussion of this amendment and this bill has been related to money and economic factors. And I represent a very urban district in which we have a number of two major coal-fired power plants, and we have school children living in the vicinity of those plants who have an elevated incidence of asthma and respiratory diseases. We have an elevated rate of cancer in the areas immediately surrounding those plants. So I think we can talk about climate change and global warming and dollars, but there is a human aspect to the impact of coal-fired energy, and we feel it in my district, and that is the case in a number of other districts. And so I think we can't lose sight of the human impact of these technologies as well.
Gentleman yield.
I yield to the ranking member.
I thank you for yielding. What you're saying is that there's an impact from burning coal, an impact from these pollutants. And in the urban areas, you see more diseases, more asthma, more health problems. Well, who pays for those health problems? Well, the patients pay, their insurance companies pay, the government pays. That is a form of subsidy to the coal industry because they don't pay the full price. They don't internalize the costs of the consequences of their business. We are also not just seeing the problems from pollution localized, we're seeing it universalized in the climate change. Climate change is whether it's changing to hot or cold. It doesn't make any difference because the pollution from carbon and other greenhouse gases is making an impact on our country and all around the world. So since we know these pollutants are causing these problems, the only prudent thing to do is to start reducing the amount of these greenhouse gas pollutants. And my Republican friends say, oh, why should we do it? Let's do it internationally. Why should we bear that cost? Well, that sounds very noble, except then if you look at their budget, they want to defund the State Department from being able to negotiate international agreements. They want the U.S. to pull out of the international climate change program. They have a writer saying that we shouldn't require other countries when they build their coal-burning power plants to install technology. They shouldn't have to do it because we're not going to do it. If they don't do it and we don't do it, what are the consequences to our children and grandchildren, even in Virginia, even in West Virginia, even in Kentucky? Now, the history of the Clean Air Act and environmental laws is not to take advantage of technology that's there, often that's helpful, but it develops new technology. Is this pie in the sky? Well, no. We wanted to reduce the emissions from automobiles, and therefore the catalytic converter was developed. We put a requirement in to reduce these pollutants, and therefore the technology followed it. That was true of the ACI, the activated carbon injector for mercury. It was true of a lot of the scrubbers. When we talked about scrubbers and required some of them, there were only 3 units around. The efforts to deal with NOx. So the technology is driven forward if we require that all these companies that produce pollution have to reduce the pollution. But what this amendment, what this bill, which would amend the Clean Air Act, wants to have us do is nothing. Don't require the coal-burning power plants to do anything. Continue to pollute. We're not going to require you to reduce the pollution. It was described as giving coal a break. Well, we give coal a break. We don't require them to pay the costs of their doing business, the external costs, the externalities, as economists would say, for what they do in their business. And in fact, we subsidize them. I don't know what kind of tax breaks they get, but any that their legislators can accomplish to get in law, they have it. And this is another bonus to them. It's the children and the grandchildren of people all over the world that will suffer if we just keep on saying, we're not going to do anything, and that's it.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Louisiana is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank the chairman for yielding and especially for bringing this legislation that I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of. If you look at air quality, it's improving right now. According to the EPA, total emissions of toxic air pollutants have decreased by approximately 42% between 1990 and 2005. So air quality is improving. This administration wants to actually go and do things that will actually not only harm the economy, but harm people. And we were just talking about health. The gentleman from California was talking about health. Who are going to be the people that suffer the most from the kinds of regulations that we're seeing being proposed by the Obama administration through EPA? It's poor people. Poor people who want to be able to afford heat in these winters. They don't want to talk about global warming anymore because we had record freezing last week. And the people that are hurt by that the most are poor people who won't be able to afford those increases in prices. These things they're proposing aren't free. They're actually incredibly costly, unproven, and will actually hurt poor people, make it harder for them to warm themselves when it's freezing. Again, they don't want to talk about global warming. You know how cold it was last week? It was so cold that it was reported that in Chicago, the polar bears couldn't even go outside because it was too cold. It was too cold for polar bears last week. And they want to actually make it harder for poor people to heat their homes. We've got common sense legislation that says if you can prove scientifically that this ought to be done and can be done, then just go through the normal legislative process. You know, when I took civics, Congress was the one that supposedly made laws. The executive branch carried out the laws. We've got an executive now who thinks
we have a law that you want to stop.
We have an executive who thinks
you have
that
a
he
law
writes the
that
law.
you want to repeal.
As it relates to the health care law, he wants to go write laws. If he has a problem that his law is creating, he'll just change the law himself. Who needs Congress? There's a legislative branch that the Constitution says is the body you go to, the people who were elected to make policy. And we debate that policy. And if it's so important that the law needs to be changed and the standards need to be changed, even as the EPA is saying air quality is improved by 42%, if they think there's a problem, come before Congress and state your case. But in the meantime, we deal with the real impacts. As Mr. Griffith said, when this administration makes changes unilaterally that cost jobs, that run jobs off to foreign countries, it's not like it all happens in a vacuum. those jobs that will then be shifted to China. The higher electricity costs that will be imposed on poor people are going to hurt them directly, but then the jobs that hurt our economy go to places like China where they don't have the environmental standards we have. They don't have that 42% improvement in air quality that we have. We have good standards because of the policy debates here, not because some president says, I want to act unilaterally. Congress tried to pass cap and trade under a Democratic-controlled House and Senate, and they couldn't do it. So this is the legislative body. This is how it's supposed to be handled. But just remember that as this administration wants to do other things outside of the realm of what Congress intended, they have devastating impacts on poor people and on our economy, and then those jobs that are shifted, the carbon leakage that occurs when these jobs go to Brazil and when they go to China and when they go to India. Those countries don't have our standards, yet all of that carbon goes up in the same atmosphere. So just think about the damage you're doing if you're opposing this legislation that says common sense standards should apply, and if changes need to happen, go through Congress. Come to the elected body of the people and state your case in a transparent and open fashion. This is an administration that promised to be the most transparent ever, and yet they want to do things more and more behind closed doors, administratively, where they don't even have the legal authority. So let's get back to a regular order where the legislative process is respected again, where the will of the people of this country is respected again, and where the impact of these devastating policies on the very most vulnerable, the poor people, are considered with all of the other impacts, and respecting the fact that even according to the EPA, we have a 42% improvement in air quality. We don't want to hurt that progress by taking a step backwards. So I thank again the gentleman for bringing this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the Waxman amendment? The gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to say I sympathize with my colleagues. One from Virginia whose folks are going to lose their jobs, or they claim they're going to lose their jobs. My district has a very high unemployment, at least twice the national average, so I understand the pain. But I submit that the EPA rules will benefit the coal industry by making it more viable in the future. If we allow the coal industry to continue to burn and pollute, ultimately there's going to be an outcry, and the coal industry is going to be shut down. And we don't want to see that. We want to see all forms of power, of energy used. So if we provide incentives for innovation, then the industry will take up those incentives. It'll improve. We'll see pollution reduction. We'll see cost reduction. And it'll be a viable industry long into the future. And I think that's an important consideration. But also, what about the people that were devastated by Superstorm Sandy and the $60 billion cost to the United States government? These weather events are going to be more costly. They're going to be more devastating. They're going to hurt more and more people. We can't ignore that. And finally, I'd like to address the provision that requires 6 demonstrated units that haven't benefited from any public assistance. I mean, that could include local taxation. Basically, what that provision does is it eliminates the ability of the EPA to require new innovation, because as Mr. Waxman pointed out, it requires that they demonstrate, but they can't demonstrate economically when they're in a competitive field. If you install technology and your competitors aren't required to do so, you're going to have a higher price, and you're going to see a reduction in competition. We have to raise the standard across the board. We'll see technology improve. We'll see coal have a long life in this country. And for those reasons, I support the Mr. Waxman's amendment, and I yield to Mr. Waxman.
I just want to say that I've been here for decades in Congress, and I was here when people came forward and said, we've got pollution problems. Congress, we want you to pass a law to deal with it. We don't want the Congress to set the standards or dictate the ways of reduction for pollutants, but we want to have a law called the Clean Air Act, where the Environmental Protection Agency develops the expertise. They have to look at all the scientific information and make a determination, and then when they set standards, the standards are to protect public health, and in order to achieve these standards, they require that reductions in pollution that threatens public health must be reduced. And if it's a localized matter, they leave it to the states to figure out their own strategies. Sometimes it's a problem between different states if there's pollution going from one state to another. So to tell my friend from Louisiana, this is the Congress, we should have a debate and then pass a law. Well, we had that debate, and we passed a law. We passed a law that was originally signed by President Nixon. We have a law that was revised and last signed after an overwhelming bipartisan vote of the Congress by President George H.W. Bush. And that law is the law that this bill before us would stop from being implemented when it comes to the carbon pollution. Now you could say, oh, wait a second, we didn't know anything about carbon pollution in 1990. Well, some of us did, but it wasn't spelled out specifically. But what was in the law was that when pollutants cause harm to public health and safety, the law required EPA to make a finding of that on that regard, and then to regulate. And who decided that? Well, the Supreme Court of the United States. You might not like their decision. You know what? I don't like a lot of their decisions either. But we are a nation of laws. And what this committee majority seems to want to do is to repeal the law and to change its impact when it comes to coal-burning power plants. EPA, you can no longer regulate it. Unless there's a technology that can achieve the reductions that's already being used. But why would we have anybody who runs a business put in the technology if their competitors aren't going to do it, if it costs them money, if it's going to detract from their business, which is to reward their shareholders? So I just want to say, the law is in effect. I compliment the gentleman from Louisiana. I'm always amazed at his skill in debate. I often felt that if I ever killed somebody, I'd ask him to represent me, and he'd probably convince me I didn't do it. But that doesn't change the world. And the world is we have a law, it's been passed, and this bill would repeal it. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. This time, recognize the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really hadn't intended to speak. I thought this was going to be something your bill would pass through relatively quickly with that. But I've listened to the debate on a couple of the issues that have been raised. One was talked about asthma and health standards. If someone would just pay a little bit more attention to the EPA's own reports that are indicating that indoor air quality is far more dangerous than outdoor air, as much as 100 times worse. And when people spend 90% of their times indoors, we've not been able to demonstrate that the disease or the health risks that they're addressing or facing have been caused by outdoor air or indoor air. So you can walk through a park a mile away from a powerhouse and be 100 times safer than breathing air in your own home or in your office. But yet we keep attacking our coal-fired powerhouses across America because it's easy to blame them. We're there to really address our indoor air quality. California, surely the gentleman from California has read their law. They're much more aggressive in California trying to address it because they understand it's not coal-fired powerhouses it's caused. It's a much more dangerous on our indoor air quality. But let's go to some of the other matters that were also talked about what answer do we have? I think what we're trying to do...
David, excuse me for interrupting. Would you speak into your microphone? I've been told that on the TV they're not picking up your voice.
The air quality, the issue of trying to address the climate change I think we're doing it in a bill that's going to be on this omnibus bill, where we're reversing a decision from this administration not to fund coal-fired powerhouses in Africa. Because what's happening in Africa has been the fact, and Al Gore and others have been talking about that the burning of the tropical rainforests in Africa and South America and elsewhere is 6 times worse in our energy, our CO2 emissions into the world. 6 times worse. And all they want, the people in Africa want to build a powerhouse so that they can cook with electricity. They can heat their homes. And we're saying, because the World Bank and the Export-Import Bank and the Treasury are saying, we're not going to loan you any money. I think you're going to see a change, the fact that under the omnibus bill, we're going to allow them to go back and refinance so that they can build coal-fired powerhouses there. We're going to reduce the CO2 emissions in the world by what we're doing, by addressing the poverty and the situation. If we want the nations of the world to emerge from poverty, you've got to give them electricity. And when they have to tear down their tropical rainforests to burn their wood so that they have heat for their home or they can cook, we're impoverishing a whole section of our world. That's not right. And they're contributing so much, unfortunately, to the CO2 emissions. So what we're doing under this administration said he wants to maintain them at a status quo. And what we're saying is we're trying, instead of that, if it's 0.2% emissions of our coal-fired powerhouses in America, 0.2% of the CO2 emissions of the world come from our coal-fired powerhouses. We're going to put at risk hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of jobs in America when we know this isn't the problem. It's easy to pick on from the other side, but the science doesn't back it up. And I get so frustrated sitting here listening to the debate about picking on coal-fired powerhouses when we're talking about, the gentleman from Virginia talks about, we can accomplish all this, we're just going to add to the cost of adding products. We're going to hurt our middle class. We're going to cause even a greater division between the rich and the poor when we start raising utility bills. We're going to drive more jobs offshore. Look, this is serious business. And this idea of pushing an ideology only crushes an industry here in America and puts at risk jobs all across. It's not just coal mining jobs. It's the railroad workers. It's the truck drivers. It's the timber industry, all that's affected by our fossil fuels, our coal. Let's be careful about it instead of playing an ideological fight. Let's find out where the real fight is, and that is to get our people with jobs again. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Is there further discussion on the Waxman amendment? If there is no further discussion, the vote would occur on the Waxman amendment. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the nays have it. Gentlemen request a recorded vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Scalise?
No.
Mr. Scalise votes no. Mr. Hall? No. Mr. Hall votes no. Mr. Shimkus? Mr. Shimkus votes no. Mr. Pitts? Mr. Pitts votes no. Mr. Terry? No. Mr. Terry votes no. Mr. Burgess? No. Mr. Burgess votes no. Mr. Latta? No. Mr. Latta votes no. Mr. Cassidy? No. Mr. Cassidy votes no. Mr. Olson? Mr. Olson votes no. Mr. McKinley? Mr. McKinley votes no. Mr. Gardner? Mr. Gardner votes no. Mr. Pompeo? Mr. Pompeo votes no. Mr. Kinzinger? Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Griffith? Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Barton? Mr. Barton votes no. Mr. Upton? Mr. Upton votes no. Mr. Rush? Mr. McNerney?
Votes aye.
Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Tonko? Mr. Tonko votes aye. Mr. Yarmouth? Mr. Yarmouth votes aye. Mr. Engel? Mr. Green? No. Mr. Green votes no. Ms. Capps? Ms. Capps votes aye. Mr. Doyle? Mr. Doyle votes aye. Mr. Barrow? Mr. Barrow votes no. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui votes aye. Ms. Christensen? Ms. Christensen votes aye. Ms. Castor? Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. Waxman? Aye. Mr. Waxman votes aye. Chairman Whitfield?
No.
Chairman Whitfield votes no.
Are all members recorded? Gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel.
Mr. Engel votes aye.
Does anyone seek recognition to be recorded? Okay, the clerk will report the result.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 10 ayes and 19 noes.
10 ayes, 19 noes. The agreement is not, the amendment is not agreed to. At this time, does anyone seek recognition to offer another amendment to the bill? Seeing no one seeking recognition, the question would now occur on forwarding H.R. 3826 to the full committee. All those in favor of the legislation signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. In opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Gentleman asked for a roll call vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Scalise. Aye. Mr. Scalise votes aye. Mr. Hall. Aye. Mr. Hall votes aye. Mr. Shimkus. Aye. Mr. Shimkus votes aye. Mr. Pitts. Aye. Mr. Pitts votes aye. Mr. Terry. Aye. Mr. Terry votes aye. Mr. Burgess. Aye. Mr. Burgess votes aye. Mr. Latta. Aye. Mr. Latta votes aye. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy votes aye. Mr. Olson. Aye. Mr. Olson votes aye. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes aye. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner votes aye. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo votes aye. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes aye. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes aye. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton votes aye. Mr. Rush. Mr. McNerney.
Votes no.
Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Tonko. No. Mr. Tonko votes no. Mr. Yarmouth. No. Mr. Yarmouth votes no. Mr. Engel. No. Mr. Engel votes no. Mr. Green. No. Mr. Green votes no. Ms. Capps. No. Ms. Capps votes no. Mr. Doyle. No. Mr. Doyle votes no. Mr. Barrow. Aye. Mr. Barrow votes aye. Ms. Matsui. No. Ms. Matsui votes no. Ms. Christensen. Ms. Christensen votes no. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes no. Mr. Waxman. No. Mr. Waxman votes no. Chairman Whitfield.
Aye.
Chairman Whitfield votes aye.
Does anyone seek recognition to record the vote? Will the clerk please report the result?
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 18 ayes and 11 nays.
The legislation is agreed to, 18 ayes, 11 nays. So the ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the legislation approved by the subcommittee today, so ordered. And pursuant to a discussion with Mr. McNerney, we have letters from organizations and labor unions in support of this legislation, and we have letters from groups opposed to legislation. Those letters will be placed into the record. And without objection, the subcommittee now stands adjourned.